All right, we're back for episode 11. 10 minutes of cold reading of the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll jump right in. We're in chapter 4 now, and we're reading Pierre-Joseph Proudhon from the Confessions of a Revolutionist, 1850. So this is, again, just in the conclusion of the 1848 revolutions. And here we go with one of the first, I guess it would be self-described anarchists. Yep, according to Michael Malice, the author, Proudhon can be regarded as the first modern intellectual to refer to himself as an anarchist, and he is the source for much of what followed philosophically. So there we go. Starting on page 35, 10 minutes cold reading. The church, like an affectionate mother, came first and said everything for the people, but all by the prince. Then came the monarchy, everything for the people, but all by the prince. Next, the doctrinaires or liberals, everything for the people, but all by the middle class. The radicals, though changing the formula, have retained the principle. Everything for the people, but all by the government. Always the same communism, the same governmentalism. Who then will say everything for the people and everything by the people, even the government? According to M. Lamartine, the government has to issue its commands and the country only to yield its consent, whereas all history tells us that the government is the best which comes nearest to making itself useless. Do we want parasites to labor or priests to speak to God? Neither do we want representatives to govern us. It has been said by someone that for man to speculate in his fellow man is open robbery, and the government of man by man is slavery. So every religion founded upon any form whatever of papal infallibility is sheer idolatry, the worship of man by man. And yet after all these fruits of the absolutist principle, we have still the judgment of man by man, the condemnation of man by man, and to crown the list, the punishment of man by man. All these, however, we must submit to, until in the progress of time they grow old, perish, and fall off like ripe fruits in their due season. They are the instruments of our apprenticeship. Philosophy repudiates these symbols of a barbarous age, and yet admits not the rights of anyone to compel a people to be free who wish to be governed. It has no confidence in any social reforms that do not arise spontaneously from the people, and acknowledges no revolutions that do not receive the initiative from the masses. And that wraps up that essay. We got some time left, so we're going to jump right on into chapter 5. This is Herbert Spencer from Social Statistics, 1851, beginning on page 37. In the intro paragraph by the author, though largely forgotten today, Herbert Spencer was one of the preeminent British intellectuals of the latter half of the 19th century. It was he and not Darwin who coined the term, quote, survival of the fittest, by which he meant that in any environment the fittest will survive, not necessarily that they should. Decades later, Murray Rothbard reportedly called social statics the greatest single work of libertarian political philosophy ever written. Yet Spencer was no anarchist and had the following chapter quietly removed from Social Statics. When it was republished years later, anarchists later found the excised chapter and republished it far and wide after his death. And the piece begins. The right to ignore the state. 1. As a corollary to the proposition that all institutions must be subordinate to the law of equal freedom, we cannot choose but admit the right of the citizen to adopt a condition of voluntary outlawry. If every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection with the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying toward its support. It is self-evident that in so behaving he in no way trenches upon the liberty of others. For his position is a passive one, and while passive, he cannot become an aggressor. It is equally self-evident that he cannot be compelled to continue one of a political corporation without a breach of the moral law. Seeing that citizenship involves payment of taxes, and the taking away of a man's property against his will is an infringement of his rights. Government being simply an agent employed in common by a number of individuals to secure to them certain advantages. The very nature of the connection implies that it is for each to say whether he will employ such an agent or not. If any one of them determines to ignore this mutual safety confederation, nothing can be said, except that he loses all claim to its good offices and exposes himself to the danger of maltreatment, a thing he is quite at liberty to do if he likes. He cannot be coerced into political combination without a breach of the law of equal freedom. He can withdraw from it without committing any such breach, and he has therefore a right so to withdraw. 2. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to the law of nature, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority mediately or immediately from this original. Thus writes Blackstone, to whom let all honor be given for having so far outseen the ideas of his time, and, indeed, we may say of our time. A good antidote this for those political superstitions which so widely prevail. A good check upon that sentiment of power worship, which still misleads us by magnifying the prerogatives of constitutional governments as it once did those of monarchs. Let men learn that a legislature is not, quote, our God upon earth, though by the authority they ascribe to it and the things they expect from it, they would seem to think it is. Let them learn rather that it is an institution serving a purely temporary purpose, whose power, when not stolen, is, at best, borrowed. Nay, indeed, have we not seen that government is essentially immoral? Is it not the offspring of evil, bearing about it all the marks of its parentage? Does it not exist because crime exists? Is it not strong, or as we say, despotic, when crime is great? Is there not more liberty, that is, less government, as crime diminishes? And must not government cease when crime ceases, for very lack of objects on which to perform its function? Not only does magisterial power exist because of evil, but it exists by evil. Violence is employed to maintain it, and all violence involves criminality. Soldiers, policemen, and gaolers, swords, batons, and fetters are instruments for inflicting pain, and all infliction of pain is, in the abstract, wrong. The state employs evil weapons to subjugate evil, and is alike contaminated by the objects with which it deals and the means by which it works. Morality cannot recognize it, for morality, being simply a statement of the perfect law, can give no countenance to anything growing out of and living by breaches of the law. Wherefore, legislative authority can never be ethical, must always be conventional merely. Hence, there is a certain inconsistency in the attempt to determine the right position, structure, and conduct of a government by appeal to the first principles of rectitude. For, as just pointed out, the acts of an institution, which is in both nature and origin imperfect, cannot be made to square with the perfect law. All that we can do is to ascertain, firstly, in what attitude a legislature must stand to the community to avoid being, by its mere existence, an embodied wrong. Secondly, in what manner it must be constituted, so as to exhibit the least incongruity with the moral law. And thirdly, to what sphere its actions must be limited to prevent it from multiplying those breaches of equity it is set up to prevent. The first condition to be conformed to before a legislature can be established without violating the law of equal freedom is the acknowledgement of the right now under discussion, the right to ignore the state. And that's the conclusion of today's reading. On page 39, again, this is from Herbert Spencer, from Social Statics, 1851. I think I misread it initially. I think I said social statistics, but it's actually Social Statics from 1851. So with that, we will stop, but I'd like to say an interesting podcast that I have been listening to over the past couple days. There's a podcast called Revolutions. It's a brilliant podcast. It's been around for many years, and if you go back, there's some great expositions of the revolutions, the American Revolution, the British Revolution, the French Revolution, I believe the Haitian Revolution, and a couple years ago, I haven't listened to it yet, but he put together, I think it's close to a 50-episode exposition on the Russian Revolution, beginning with some of the anarchists and some of the proto-socialists from this exact time period. You know, now we're talking the early to mid 1800s. So that's where I am with that podcast, and it's going to run right up through the Russian Revolution. So I'm very excited to finish that. It's almost a good listen along, if you will, to this book, at least at this point of this book. So I would highly recommend that. It's called Revolutions, and it's the mini-series called The Russian Revolution. So again, that wraps it up. Speaking of Russian, the Anarchist Handbook by Michael Malice. Organized by Michael Malice. And the physical copy is awesome. Digital's great, audio's great, but a physical copy can be stuck in a wall, stuck in a safe, handed to somebody, nearly irregardless of the technology, the surveillance technology that is there now or might come about. So highly recommend getting a physical copy or 3 of this book. And if you have any people who might be interested, probably not the worst thing to hand out as a gift. I have a whole stack of Bastiat's The Law that I got a few years ago and hand them out to people who I think might be ready for what's in there. So that's it. We're a little long. Apologize. Share with your friends if they might want to hear some brutally bad cold reading of a great book.